We sped down the dark road, and the engine of our armored van roared so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. The cramped compartment smelled of iron and sweat, and my hands gripped my weapon, feeling the familiar cold of the metal. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees that flashed by, casting eerie shadows. My bulletproof vest pressed tightly against my chest, but I tried to ignore it and stay focused. We had all been scrambled so quickly that I didn't even have time to fully grasp what was going on. I caught the eye of Captain Lars Hunt, nicknamed Thunder, who sat next to the driver. "Cap, what the hell happened?" I asked, hoping for some clarity. The captain didn't turn around, but his voice came low and resonant. "Remember that psycho who's been attacking people in town? The police have been after him for a month but couldn't catch him." I remembered. A homeless killer whose face had made front pages multiple times. He'd murdered a couple of people right on the street, and the witnesses had described him with a kind of panic that made it sound like they'd seen a beast, not a man. The gruesome details still sent chills down my spine. "Did they finally find him?" I asked. "Yeah," the captain replied, still calm. "Witnesses spotted him in the woods near a recreation center. The police cornered him, but he managed to get away and barricaded himself in a hunting cabin at the edge of the forest. They think he might be armed. That's why they called us in." Sitting nearby was Sergeant Daniel Rivers, call sign Phantom. He was inspecting his rifle like he hoped it held the answers to all the unsettling questions. Daniel was usually calm and collected, but today, a note of unease slipped into his voice. "That guy's a demon," he muttered, almost like he was talking to himself. "No kidding," agreed Owen, the K-9 officer who was seated with us, petting his dog, Zeus. Zeus, a massive black dog, was alert, his ears perked up at every sound. There were 10 of us packed inside. Some sat still, treating it like just another mission, while others tapped nervously on their body armor, trying to drown out the growing tension. Rumors about the madman had already become urban legend. People called him the Ripper, and there was a sinister magic to that name, as if saying it summoned fear itself. Disappearances around town had been linked to him, and local authorities were tearing their hair out every time he slipped through their grasp. "They say he's more beast than man," murmured Sergeant Stevenson, a normally cheerful guy who now looked grim. The van jolted over a bump, and I found myself staring into the dark woods outside. The trees rushed past like ominous sentinels, closing in on either side. Stevenson turned to the captain, his voice uneasy. "Cap, you really think he's a beast?" Captain Hunt shot him a stern look. "Stop with the nonsense. Get ready. We're almost there." Soon the vehicle screeched to a halt and we began filing out, checking our gear and preparing for action. The hum of engines drowned out our tense chatter and the night air hit my face, cold and foreboding. Around the cabin where we arrived, there were numerous police cars. Flashing lights bathed everything in anxious shades of red and blue. Officers bustled about, trying to secure the perimeter, but there was an air of confusion in their movements. Some whispered with pale faces while others clung to their guns, as if that gave them any comfort. Captain Hunt was immediately approached by the lead officer on the scene, a man with a sweaty brow and a face white as chalk, as if he'd seen a ghost. He hurried over, breathing heavily, like his heart was about to burst out of his chest. "Captain," he gasped, barely holding himself together. "We've been chasing that psycho, all the way from downtown." I tensed, listening to his account. The officer, visibly shaken, continued, "We first spotted him near the metro station, where he attacked 2 pedestrians, leaving them injured. We pursued him through the empty lots and the old market before he made a run for the woods. We opened fire. I swear, Captain, that guy moved like an animal. He dodged bullets like he could sense where we were aiming. Around us, people slowed down, listening intently. The officer shuddered. I saw it myself. I shot him in the leg. I swear to God, I hit him. But he didn't feel any pain, didn't even slow down. We saw the blood trail, all of us did, so I know I hit him. But he looked just like the photos. You'll know him when you see him, Captain. I exchanged uneasy glances with the rest of the team. Daniel's face was as impassive as ever, but his eyes narrowed at the story. The officer pointed to the old, abandoned house ahead. He's holed up in there, Captain. We've cordoned off the building. It's been deserted for years. No one goes there. They say there are some old government facilities a couple of miles from here. Labs or something. But we know for sure he's inside. He exhaled, trying to collect his thoughts. We saw him peek out the windows. We fired, but we didn't dare go in. Not after what he did to Officer Rodriguez. I winced. I knew Miguel Rodriguez well. Visited him in the hospital after that attack. Those wounds, deep slashes, and mangled flesh. Miguel survived, but he was forever scarred. Captain Hunt listened, then nodded, his jaw tightening. He turned to us, raising his voice to be heard clearly. All right, you heard him. Standard procedure. Phantom, take the south side. We need sniper coverage. Storm, prep charges in case we need to breach. Spark, you're leading the assault team. We clear it floor by floor. The goal is to neutralize the target. We're not chasing him through the whole forest. If he's armed, we use decisive force. He scanned our faces, his eyes sharp and determined. Stay in communication, quick and clean. Any questions? No one spoke up. We lined up in front of the house, weapons at the ready. Adrenaline pounded at my temples, and I could feel my heart thumping in sync with every second that brought us closer to a possible confrontation. As the leader of the assault team, the responsibility for each of these guys weighed heavily on me. Assault team, on me, steady and confident, I spoke into the radio, doing my best to mask the tension in my voice. Phantom, our sniper, had taken position on the southern side, keeping an eye on the windows and any possible exits. Storm, get the charge ready in case we need to blow the upstairs doors, I added before stepping over the threshold. The front door was unlocked, which in itself felt off. I nudged it open with the barrel of my weapon, and we cautiously moved inside. Outside, the wail of police sirens still echoed, but in the darkness of the abandoned house, it was quiet as a grave. The air smelled of damp and rotting wood, and each footstep reverberated through the empty halls like a muffled drumbeat. Team, spread out along the perimeter. Sweep the first floor, I whispered into the radio, barely audible. We started clearing the rooms. The first one was a dusty, cluttered space filled with broken chairs and trash, as if it hadn't seen visitors in years. An old chandelier swung from the ceiling, creaking in the draft and amplifying the eerie silence. We moved further, checking every corner. Officer Stevenson held the door as I entered the next room. Empty shelves, a moldy, decrepit couch. No signs of recent activity. Clear, I murmured, and the team advanced. We slowly ascended the creaky staircase to the second floor. Every step was measured, guns trained forward, fingers tight on the triggers. The stairs felt fragile, each creak echoing like the house itself was protesting our intrusion. I glanced out the window at Phantom, who gave me a silent nod. Pair up and check the rooms one by one. Report any movement immediately, I ordered. My team moved down the narrow, peeling hallway. The first rooms were empty. Decaying mattresses, collapsing furniture. The walls seemed to absorb our unease, and something heavy, almost malevolent, hung in the air. One last room remained at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, almost as if beckoning us in. "Get ready," I said, my chest tightening with a sense of impending dread. I signaled to Storm, who carefully pushed the door open. Then something completely impossible happened. A man lunged out with a wild ferocity that took my breath away. His eyes were crazed, and his movements were unlike anything I'd ever seen in a human, swift and animalistic. He charged at us. "Fire!" I shouted, and the room erupted in a flurry of gunfire. But the suspect moved with inhuman speed, dodging bullets like a beast running on all fours. He struck one of our guys, sending him crashing into the wall with a force that made the wooden boards groan in protest. We scattered, trying to hold our positions, but this man, this monster, began scaling the walls like a spider, leaping from side to side. Bullets whizzed through the air but failed to find their mark. "He's heading downstairs," someone yelled, and we barreled after him down the staircase, shooting into the darkness. I caught a glimpse of him, a blur moving impossibly fast, vanishing into the shadows below. "I've got eyes on him. He's headed for the basement," I shouted into the radio. We hit the first floor, adrenaline coursing through our veins and breath ragged from the chase. He had disappeared into the blackness of a crooked door leading down to the basement. "Stay sharp, guys," I said, feeling the cold grip of fear tightening in my chest. Whatever this was, man or beast, it was luring us deeper into its lair. We cautiously descended into the basement, each step thudding louder than it should have in the oppressive silence. Darkness closed around us like a thick shroud, pierced only by the beams of our flashlights. I swung my light around the room, my gun following every movement, every shadow a potential threat. The basement was damp and reeked of mold, the air thick and suffocating. The walls were uneven and cracked, with old wooden crates covered in cobwebs. Shards of glass and rusted metal fragments littered the floor. I led the way, creeping forward, hearing my team's hushed footsteps behind me. Broken light bulbs hung useless from the ceiling, silent witnesses to something dark and forgotten. A rustling noise shattered the stillness, like something slithering at the far end of the basement. I flinched, swinging my flashlight toward the sound. My heart thudded, but there was nothing. Only emptiness. I clenched my jaw, willing myself to stay calm. Then I saw it. A passage at the far end of the basement, leading down yet another staircase, spiraling into the dark. It looked like part of an older structure, some hidden underground complex that had been lying dormant for decades. The walls were concrete, slick with mold and lined with tangled roots. Wires and corroded pipes snaked out from the depths, as if this place once served a purpose long since forgotten. I pressed the radio button. "Spark to Captain Hunt. We've found an underground tunnel. It looks like it goes much deeper. We may need backup to secure the area. This is bigger than we thought." Captain Hunt's voice crackled back. "Copy that, Spark. Reinforcements are en route. Keep the channel open and don't take unnecessary risks." I took a deep breath and looked at my team. Their faces were tense but unwavering. I nodded, signaling that we were moving forward. "Let's go." "Slow and steady," I said, and we began our descent into the narrow corridor. The passage twisted and turned, the walls closing in as if the tunnel had been hastily carved or built for something that was never meant to be found. Old, rusted lamp fixtures clung to the walls, and thick, dust-covered cables ran along the floor. Sometimes, the wires flickered with a faint dying light, as if some residual energy still pulsed through them. Rusty pipes lined the ceiling, dripping water that created a maddening rhythmic noise. Our steps were muted by a layer of grime, but each heartbeat sounded deafening. The further we went, the heavier the atmosphere became. We continued down the narrow, winding corridor, lighting our way with the dim glow of our flashlights. Wires stretched along the walls, looking ready to snap, like old threads barely holding on to the weight of oblivion. Communication with the outside world began to falter. First crackling through the radio, then dead silence. I tried to check in with Captain Hunt, but there was nothing on the other end, just a hollow void. The guys exchanged glances, and I clenched my jaw. We were on our own now. Wherever this corridor led, we'd have to find out without any outside support. "Keep moving," I said, trying to infuse my voice with confidence. We pressed forward, carefully stepping over a thick layer of ancient dust. The corridor seemed to swallow us whole, growing darker, the ceiling pressing lower, the walls closing in, as if we were being swallowed by some ancient beast. Sometimes the passage twisted sharply, each turn feeling like a potential trap. Finally, we reached a massive metal door, its surface marred with rust and dark stains, as if someone had tried desperately to break in or out. I signaled the team to stop, wiped sweat from my forehead, and grasped the cold handle, cautiously pulling the door open. It groaned in protest, and the beams of our flashlights revealed something entirely unexpected. We had stepped into a vast underground chamber, reminiscent of an abandoned laboratory. The lighting here still worked, though the bulbs flickered as if in a nightmare. Torn, yellowed documents littered the floor. Shelves lined with test tubes and jars stood around us, some shattered with dark, dried stains marking forgotten experiments. The walls were covered in strange photographs and diagrams, blurry images of faces, some human, others twisted and animal-like, deformed beyond recognition. One particularly disturbing photograph showed a person with wolf-like features, eyes wide and frozen in a moment of sheer terror, staring directly into the camera. In one corner, I noticed papers scattered haphazardly. I picked up a folder and scanned the text. Subject 12, Advanced Hair Growth, Skeletal Mutations. Some of the documents had rusty claw marks, and others were smudged with what looked like damp, muddy paw prints. This was no ordinary laboratory. "Jesus," muttered one of our guys, his voice echoing under the high ceilings. Clumps of thick gray fur lay strewn across the floor, and deep claw marks scored the walls, as if something had tried to claw its way out. I realized that whatever this place was hiding, we had stumbled onto something far beyond our understanding. My gut twisted with a cold fear that only deepened with each passing moment. I ordered the team to keep moving, and we continued exploring the cursed lab, bracing ourselves for any surprise. We proceeded carefully, inspecting each office and room. Some were simple living quarters, neatly made cots, as if the occupants had expected to return. Kitchens rusted with decay, and nearby archives overflowed with yellowed folders and scattered papers. The air reeked of mildew and stale fear, an atmosphere heavy with secrets that time had failed to erase. I couldn't help but wonder what had driven people to abandon this place so suddenly. Why had they left their belongings behind, frozen in time? Yet, I remained on edge. We knew that the guy we were after, the Ripper, was somewhere in this maze. He could be lurking in any shadow, behind any door. We moved on until my flashlight caught something strange ahead. Standing in the middle of the corridor was a child. A boy, no older than 5, clutching a dirty stuffed bear. His wide, frightened eyes stared back at us, frozen in our beams like a cornered animal. We stopped in our tracks, shocked and confused. "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" I managed to say. The boy didn't answer. He just stared at us, terrified. I took a cautious step forward, but he spun around and bolted. "Wait, stop!" I shouted, but he didn't listen. We charged after him, our heavy boots pounding the ground. The boy slipped around a corner and ducked into a partially open room. I signaled the team to follow and we burst in, flashlights slicing through the darkness. But he was gone. The room was empty, filled with scattered papers and outdated equipment. As I tried to catch my breath, I saw him, the Ripper. He stood in the far corner, motionless, malevolent, his eyes wild with hate. His lips twisted into a snarling grin. Long, matted hair fell over his shoulders, and his skin was filthy, marked with scratches and claw marks. His tattered clothes hung off him in shreds, and blood-stained hands peeked from his sleeves. I raised my weapon. "Freeze! Don't move!" I barked, my voice echoing through the cold air. The Ripper stood still, but then his body began to convulse violently. His spine arched as if an electric current coursed through him. Bones cracked and reshaped, muscles twisted and reformed. His neck elongated, his jaw stretched grotesquely, and sharp fangs erupted from his mouth. His eyes turned feral, pupils narrowing into slits. Before our eyes, he transformed into something inhuman. Thick black fur sprouted across his body, his fingers extended into long, razor-sharp claws. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The air grew heavy, suffocating. This was no longer a man. This was a beast. A real werewolf, standing before us, ready to tear us apart. At that moment, I felt my heart hammering in a frantic rhythm, pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. It was fear, primal, feral fear, that locked me in place, but with it came a wild, animalistic urge to survive. The damn thing that had just transformed into a nightmare creature before our eyes seemed like something ripped straight from a horror movie and thrust into harsh reality. My brain screamed that this was impossible, but instinct took over. I summoned every ounce of willpower to shout, "Open fire! Shoot!" My fingers clenched around the trigger, and the air erupted with the deafening roar of gunfire. Bullets whizzed through the room, puncturing walls and ricocheting off metal surfaces. Yet the creature, it moved with unreal agility, dodging our shots like a ghost. We were hitting it. I could see the sparks and bits of fur flying off with each impact, but the bullets seemed useless. The werewolf barely slowed, as if the hail of metal was merely grazing its monstrous body. "Damn bullets aren't working," someone yelled, their voice full of terror. The creature paused for a heartbeat, straightened up, and then, with a furious roar, lunged at us. It was so fast we could barely register what was happening before it was upon us, scattering us like rag dolls. The first blow hit one of my men, sending him crashing into the wall with a force that splintered the wooden boards. I felt a powerful claw grip me, and the world spun violently. I was thrown across the room, slamming into a shelf of shattered containers before collapsing onto the concrete floor. Everything went dark in an instant, like someone had flipped a switch. When I came to, Daniel was leaning over me. His face was pale but alive, and he shook my shoulder frantically. "Spark, wake up, you okay?" I blinked my eyes open, the world blurring and swimming before slowly coming into focus. I sat up, my head throbbing like a drum, every movement sending waves of pain crashing through my skull. Looking around, I saw the rest of the team, bruised and battered, but alive. Someone was clutching a shoulder, another groaning in pain, but thank God we were all still breathing. What the hell had happened? Why hadn't it killed us? I looked at Daniel, searching his eyes for answers. He shook his head, visibly shaken. "I don't know, Spark. It could have killed us, but it just tossed us aside like..." His voice trailed off, words failing him. I didn't understand either, but a chilling thought lodged itself in my mind. Something about this wasn't right. Why had this creature, with all its monstrous strength, chosen not to end us? What had stopped it? Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, we decided to follow it. Not just out of duty, but because now it was personal. We had to understand what was happening here. Storm was cursing under his breath, nervously adjusting his gear. That thing. It was a demon, a real monster from hell, he growled. I couldn't disagree. That creature, and this entire place, felt like a nightmare made real, some horror unleashed from the bowels of evil itself. I clenched my teeth, fighting the icy fear crawling down my spine. We soon entered a massive room that looked like an old conference hall. Tables and chairs lay overturned, the walls cracked and crumbling, yet old posters still clung to the walls. One poster drew our attention immediately. It depicted a monstrous figure, its horrific outline resembling the creature we had just faced. The caption read in bold letters, "Test Subject 13. The image of the beast, with its savage fangs and yellow eyes, seemed to taunt us from the worn-out paper. Next to the poster hung diagrams, complicated charts, and tables full of scientific jargon we could barely comprehend. We began to scour the room. One of our guys, Sergeant Stevenson, spotted something in a corner and waved us over. "Hey, look at this!" We gathered around as he lifted a tattered piece of paper. It seemed to be a note, perhaps written by one of the scientists who had worked here. I read it aloud, my voice unsteady with a mix of fear and confusion. The subject exhibits extreme regenerative capabilities, savage yet highly intelligent. It seems the scientists have underestimated its potential, and the consequences could be catastrophic. The paper was full of scientific terms, mutations, regeneration, aggression. It all sounded like a dire warning. I glanced around, my heart pounding harder. "This place," I whispered. "It holds the truth of what went wrong here. It's responsible for this horror." We pressed on, the corridor eventually opening into a vast chamber, the heart of the laboratory. The space was lit by flickering, nightmarish lights, and the shadows seemed to come alive with each trembling bulb. In the center of the room stood a massive glass enclosure. Storm, his voice barely a whisper, murmured, "What the hell is this?" His words were heavy with a mix of dread and disbelief, the only sound that dared to challenge the stifling stillness of the room. Inside the glass enclosure were people, seemingly ordinary civilians. Some lay motionless on the floor, their faces pale and lifeless. Others sat huddled, clutching their knees as if trying to shield themselves from some invisible terror. Their eyes stared blankly, filled with pain and hopelessness. It was as if they had been trapped in an eternal nightmare, with no hope of escape. In the center of the enclosure stood a glass capsule filled with a strange red liquid. It shimmered, pulsing with a life of its own, vibrating so intensely it seemed to make the very air quiver. The crimson fluid inside the capsule appeared almost organic, as if it were alive, bubbling and writhing like the heart of some monstrous creature, pulsing with a sinister energy that infected the entire space. We moved closer to the glass capsule, and what I saw made me stop in my tracks. The people inside weren't just imprisoned. They were bound by chains, heavy metal cuffs clasped around their wrists and ankles, pinning them down and preventing any attempt to stand. One of them lifted their head and noticed us. For a moment, life sparked in their eyes, a mix of horror and desperate hope. They stirred, pulling at their restraints, some reaching toward the glass, their mouths moving in silent pleas we couldn't hear. Cries and sobs quickly filled the room, people begging us for help, their voices trembling with fear and desperation, as if they'd long lost hope and only just rediscovered it. We cautiously surveyed the area, weapons ready. This place screamed of something horrific lurking behind all these events. Why were these people imprisoned here? What dark secrets did this lab conceal? While we were trying to make sense of it all, I noticed a door at the far end of the hall with a keypad lock. When I approached and tried the handle, to my surprise, it opened easily. My brows furrowed. Someone clearly wasn't trying to keep us out, which only made me more uneasy. "Everyone inside! Stay close!" I commanded, signaling for the team to move quickly. The people in the capsule, seeing we were about to leave, began crying louder, some breaking down in tears, begging us to free them. I instructed my men to start unchaining them, working as fast as they could, while I kept an eye out, listening for any sign of danger. Then I saw him. The boy. The same child we had seen earlier. He stood in the corner, near a passage on the opposite side of the room, staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. I told the others to hurry and stay alert, then slowly made my way toward the child. The moment I took a step, he turned and ran, disappearing through a doorway into a dark corridor. "Hey, wait!" I shouted and sprinted after him. We raced through the twisting hallways, our footsteps echoing back at us, strange and hostile. The boy veered left and vanished through a slightly ajar door. When I entered, I froze. It was a child's room, but something was wrong. The floor was strewn with stuffed animals, so many that they nearly covered the boy, who was huddled among them as if trying to hide. I approached carefully and said softly, "Hey, kid, it's okay. You're safe now." Slowly, with those terrified eyes still locked on mine, he crawled out of the pile and stepped closer. In his gaze, I saw not just fear, but a childlike trust that made my heart clench. I knelt down, speaking gently. "Are you all alone here? I promise I'll take you somewhere safe. No one will hurt you." He nodded, and I carefully lifted him into my arms. He clung to my neck, curling up as if he couldn't believe someone was there to protect him. I felt him trembling and silently vowed to get him out of this hellhole, to keep him safe from whatever nightmares lay in this cursed place. Just as I turned to leave, holding the boy close, a sharp scream rang out through my radio. One of my men's voices, raw with panic, shouted, "She's here! That thing is outside!" Ice flooded my veins. I heard another shout, "Stay on high alert!" But the strangest part was that the creature wasn't attacking. The tension was mounting, like a bowstring pulled to the point of breaking. Realizing that something terrible was happening outside, I clutched the boy and rushed back toward the capsule. But before I could reach it, another panicked cry blared over the radio. "The door! Who closed the door?" My throat went dry. I burst into the room with the capsule to see my team and the people they were trying to free now trapped inside. They pounded on the glass, their faces twisted in terror. And standing outside was that creature, the werewolf with burning yellow eyes. My men kept their weapons trained on it, but it didn't attack. Instead, the creature approached a nearby control panel. It lifted a clawed, fur-covered hand and pressed a button. A cold dread filled me instantly. Without thinking, I raised my gun and aimed, but it was too late. The werewolf had already triggered something. The capsule in the center, filled with that ominous red liquid, began to bubble and churn like a boiling cauldron. I watched in horror as the liquid pulsed and frothed, and an overwhelming fear seized me. Soon, thick red smoke started pouring from the capsule, rapidly filling the enclosed space. "Shoot the glass! Break it!" I yelled, and the room echoed with gunfire. But to our dismay, the bullets only ricocheted off the reinforced glass, leaving barely a scratch. Holding the boy tight, I fired desperately, but nothing worked. The crimson smoke enveloped everything inside the capsule, shrouding the people in a thick, swirling mist, transforming them into ghostly silhouettes. I kept shooting, hoping, praying to shatter that barrier, but it was useless. As the smoke began to thin, I stood there, frozen, eyes glued to the scene before me. My hands trembled, and I could feel my heartbeat drumming in my ears. The werewolf remained still, watching, not attacking. It just stood there, observing, as if waiting for something. When the red smoke finally cleared, I braced myself for what I knew would be a nightmare come to life. Everyone inside the glass cube lay unconscious on the floor, as if ripped away from this reality. My fingers could barely keep a grip on my weapon, and my heart clenched with fear and helplessness. But soon, what I dreaded most began to unfold. The people inside started to convulse, their bodies twisting into unnatural shapes, as though something was breaking them from the inside out. Bones cracked with a gut-wrenching sound, their faces contorted in agony. I watched as their hands elongated, morphing into clawed, beastly paws, as thick fur sprouted from their skin. Their faces stretched and warped, jaws expanding into wolf-like muzzles, with sharp fangs gleaming in the dim light. These were my comrades, the people I had fought alongside through fire and hell, now turning into monsters. My insides twisted with horror. God, no, I whispered, a sinking sense of hopelessness gripping me. This was a nightmare beyond imagination, watching friends I had trusted, warriors I had stood shoulder to shoulder with, transform into creatures I couldn't hope to stop. The werewolves they had become let out a deep, guttural roar, a sound that rumbled through my chest and saturated the air with raw fear. They thrashed around the cube, slamming into the walls with a mindless, animalistic fury, their sheer power making the reinforced glass quake. Cracks began to spread across the surface, thin lines that grew larger with every impact. I knew the containment wouldn't hold much longer. Run? The single word flashed through my mind. I turned, clutching the child tightly to my chest, and bolted. Once in the corridor, I spotted a staircase leading upward. My heart pounded, feeling like it might explode from my chest. I raced toward the stairs, legs nearly buckling from the adrenaline. As I ascended, a thunderous crash echoed behind me, the sound of shattering glass. The cube had broken. They were loose. A wave of icy terror swept over me. I could hear the beasts tearing through the lab, their massive paws pounding the floor, and I knew they were coming for me. Fear propelled me forward through the hellish maze of corridors. The howls and snarls grew closer, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I ran on, feeling the shadow of the predators nipping at my heels, ready to rip me apart. Then, through the blur of light and shadow in the hallways, I caught sight of a faint glow. Hope ignited in my chest. The exit was near. I grabbed my radio, fumbling with it in my trembling hands. "Captain Hunt!" I shouted, voice cracking with desperation. "We need backup, for God's sake. Send everything you've got. Call the damn army if you have to. These things won't stop." On the other end, Captain Hunt's voice came through, confused and strained. "Spark, what the hell are you talking about?" But before I could answer, another deafening crash erupted behind me, and the roars drew nearer. The child in my arms squirmed, his breathing becoming erratic and heavy. "Hang on, kid. Just a little longer," I whispered, holding him close. But as I glanced down at his face, our eyes met, and I saw it. His eyes were yellow. His pupils had narrowed into vertical slits like a beast's. Panic shot through me, and I instinctively pushed him away. He fell, but instead of collapsing to the ground, he flipped and landed gracefully on his feet, moving with a wild, inhuman agility. He looked at me with a cruel, animalistic glint in his eyes, his mouth curling into a predatory grin. My blood ran cold. A horrifying realization hit me. Could this child have been the mastermind behind all of this? The monster lurking in plain sight? I didn't know, but fear gripped me like a vice. I raised my rifle, aiming it at him, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But he didn't move. He just stared at me with seething hatred before suddenly leaping to the side, vanishing into the shadows with inhuman speed. It was a grotesque, nightmarish sight that sent shivers down my spine. Behind me, the heavy pounding footsteps of the werewolves grew louder. They were closing in, and I didn't have time to think. I sprinted toward the exit, kicking the door with all my strength. It flew off its hinges, and I burst into the open night air. I kept running, never looking back, feeling the terror hot on my heels as I escaped the nightmare of the lab and into the darkness beyond. I stopped, utterly exhausted. My legs burned with fatigue, and my breathing was heavy and ragged, each gasp of air stabbing my chest with pain. The adrenaline that had propelled me forward was wearing off, and a wave of weakness washed over me. I couldn't run any farther, couldn't even take another step. I leaned against the nearest tree, trying desperately to calm my pounding heart. Suddenly, I heard it. Heavy, muffled footsteps. A monstrous roar shattered the stillness of the night forest, and I shrank back, instinctively diving into the nearest bushes. I held my breath, hiding in the dense undergrowth. Lying in the dirt, I watched as the creatures, the terrifying werewolves who had once been my comrades and the unfortunate captives from the lab, thundered past. They moved on all fours, their bodies covered in black fur, muscles rippling with every leap. Yellow eyes glowed fiercely in the darkness, and their snarling jaws were twisted into expressions of wild, ravenous hunger. They roared and growled, paying no attention to me, as if something far more important was luring them deeper into the woods. I lay there, teeth clenched, praying they wouldn't catch my scent, and watched as they disappeared among the trees, swallowed by the night. When their forms had finally vanished from sight, I let out a shaky breath, realizing just how close I'd come to being their prey. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one idea rang clear. What kind of hell had we unleashed? I stayed still for several more minutes, not daring to make a sound, before cautiously emerging from my hiding place. My only goal now was to find people, to reach civilization, where I could report the nightmare that had unfolded at the lab. Without looking back, I ran in the opposite direction, fear still pressing down on me from within. Later, the area was cordoned off. I was interrogated, sitting in silence as men in uniforms asked their questions, and I told them everything. About what had happened to my team, about the monsters that had escaped, and about the child with yellow eyes who turned out to be far more sinister than he seemed. They didn't believe me at first, but my haggard, broken words and the accounts from those who had seen the ruins of the lab began to crack their skepticism. What became of those creatures, I never found out. The werewolves had vanished into the forest, and wherever they had gone, I knew that the nightmare was far from over. Something dark and terrible had awakened, and there was no way to cage it back. The road stretched before me, a ribbon of gray slicing through the heart of America's vast, nocturnal landscape. Streetlights were scarce, their dim glow swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. My eyes felt heavy, weighed down by the relentless monotony of the drive and a fatigue that seemed to seep into my bones. I had been driving for hours, the endless road a hypnotic lullaby, when the sight of a supermarket emerged, an incongruous beacon in the desolation. Its neon sign flickered in the night, casting an eerie glow on the deserted parking lot. I was puzzled. A supermarket here in the middle of nowhere? It was as though it had sprung up from the ground, born from the night itself. I pulled into the parking lot, gravel crunching under my tires, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, a stark contrast to the low hum of the car's machinery moments before. I sat there for a moment, collecting my thoughts, the neon sign's flicker reflecting off the dashboard. Pushing the car door open, I stepped out into the cool night air. It was refreshing, a welcome reprieve from the stuffiness of the car. I stretched my limbs, my joints protesting with audible pops. As I approached the supermarket, a bell chimed above the door, announcing my entrance. The interior was bathed in fluorescent light, sterile and uninviting. There was a mustiness in the air, the scent of old produce and cleaning fluids. The owner, a man with a weathered face and a bored expression, glanced up from his magazine. "Evening," he muttered, his voice devoid of surprise or interest. He returned his gaze to the pages before him, uninterested in why a customer might find his way here at this late hour. I wandered the aisles, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the linoleum floors. The shelves were lined with cans and boxes, their labels faded and covered in dust. I picked up a can of soup, examining it under the harsh light. It felt like a relic from another time. As I made my way to the back of the store, where the refrigerated goods hummed in their cool compartments, I felt a chill that wasn't from the air conditioning. It was a sensation that crept up my spine, a primal warning. Then, a scream shattered the silence. It was distant yet piercing, a sound filled with terror and pain. I froze, the can of soup slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. The scream, still echoing in my ears, had jolted me into a state of primal fear. My breath became shallow, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. In the sudden silence that followed, a soft, unidentifiable noise seemed to creep through the aisles, like the rustling of leaves in a dead forest. Instinctively, I crouched behind a nearby shelf, my heart racing. I strained my ears, trying to discern any movement or sound. The fluorescent lights hummed above, the only constant in this surreal tableau. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. I dared not move, my eyes scanning the shadows that danced along the aisles. The supermarket, once just a mundane stop, had transformed into a labyrinth of fear. Suddenly, the sound of a vehicle approaching broke the silence. My mind raced. Who could it be at this hour, in such a desolate place? I contemplated rushing out to warn them, but the memory of the scream held me back. What if whatever caused it was still lurking around? I inched towards the end of the aisle, peering cautiously towards the entrance. The owner was no longer at the cash register. Where had he gone? The store felt even more deserted, a void of human presence. As the vehicle came to a stop outside, I heard doors opening and closing. Footsteps approached, hesitant and slow. A chill ran down my spine. I was about to witness something, but what? The bell above the door chimed as new customers entered. A woman's scream pierced the air, a different tone from the first, but equally filled with terror. My pulse quickened. I had to see what was happening. I crept towards the entrance, each step deliberate and silent. There I saw a middle-aged couple, their faces frozen in horror, staring towards the cash register. The woman's hands were clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Summoning courage, I stepped out of hiding. They recoiled at my sudden appearance, their fear palpable. I raised my hands, a universal sign of peace, trying to articulate that I was not a threat. "It's okay, I didn't." My voice trailed off, unsure of what I was trying to communicate. "Be quiet," I whispered urgently. "We don't know what's here." They nodded, their bodies tense, ready to flee at any moment. Together we approached the cash register, the source of their terror. The sight that greeted us was macabre. The store owner lay on the ground, his body twisted in an unnatural pose, a pool of blood spreading around him. His lifeless eyes stared at the ceiling, reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. A gasp escaped my lips. The couple clung to each other, their faces a mask of shock and fear. The reality of the situation was overwhelming. We were in grave danger, and we needed to act. But first, we had to understand what had happened here. Who or what had done this? And more importantly, was it still nearby, hiding in the shadows, waiting for us? The air in the supermarket felt heavier, charged with a malevolent energy. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights, sent shivers down my spine. We were not alone. The air was thick with tension, our minds grappling with the grim reality before us. The chime of the doorbell cut through the silence, snapping us back to the present. We turned, startled, to see another man entering the store. His initial confusion at seeing us huddled together quickly turned to horror as he caught sight of the body. The newcomer, a tall figure with a rugged appearance, staggered backwards, hand covering his mouth as nausea overwhelmed him. We exchanged anxious glances, the unspoken fear in our eyes mirroring each other's. Realizing the need for action, I suggested calling the police. But as we each pulled out our cell phones, a sinking feeling set in. No signal. The isolation of our location had become our enemy. "We need to find a landline," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The group nodded in agreement, and we began a frantic search for a stationary phone. The supermarket seemed larger now, each aisle a potential hiding place for more horrors. Finally, we found the phone, but our hope was short-lived. The cord had been deliberately cut, rendered useless. A collective sense of despair washed over us. We were cut off from the world, trapped in this nightmare. Gathering in an aisle, we introduced ourselves in hushed tones. The new arrival was John, his face still pale from the shock. The couple, Mark and Sarah, clung to each other, their eyes wide with fear. As we started to discuss our next steps, the sound of the doorbell chimed again. 3 more people entered, their faces etched with the same confusion and fear that had gripped us moments before. They froze at the sight of the group and the visible bloodstains on the floor. "We have to leave now," one of them exclaimed, panic in his voice. The atmosphere was electric with fear, everyone ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. But where could we go? The night outside was dark and unwelcoming, the road seemingly endless. And yet, the supermarket had become a place of death and dread. Staying here felt just as dangerous as venturing out into the unknown. We hastily explained the situation to the newcomers, their faces turning ashen as the reality of our predicament sank in. There were now 8 of us, 8 scared souls bound together by a twist of fate in this desolate place. The decision was made to leave in a group, to stick together for safety. We gathered whatever supplies we could find, bottled water, canned food, a few flashlights, and prepared to step out into the dark night. But as we approached the door, a sense of foreboding gripped me. What if whatever caused this was still out there, lurking in the shadows? We were about to step into its domain, unarmed and vulnerable. I glanced back at the lifeless body of the store owner, a silent sentinel to the horror that had unfolded here. What secrets did he take to his grave? What unseen danger lurked just beyond our perception? With a deep breath, we pushed open the door, stepping into the cool night air. The supermarket, with its flickering neon sign, stood behind us like a tombstone marking the end of normalcy. We moved towards the parking lot, a sense of urgency propelling us forward. The cool night air brushed against my skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the supermarket's fluorescent bulbs. As we stepped outside, the vast emptiness of the landscape engulfed us, a desolate backdrop to our growing unease. The parking lot, a patch of gravel and dirt, lay to the side of the supermarket. It was bathed in a dim, almost ghostly light from the few functioning street lamps. Our footsteps crunched underfoot, a chorus of anxiety and anticipation. Upon reaching our cars, a collective gasp escaped our lips. Each vehicle had its tires slashed, deflated and useless. Mark knelt down, inspecting the damage. "Looks like they've been cut, with a knife or something like claws," he said, his voice trembling with disbelief. Jack, one of the new arrivals, pointed out something even more alarming. The fuel tanks of the cars had been ruptured, gasoline pooling beneath them, reflecting the moonlight in sinister, shimmering patches. The realization hit us like a wave of cold water. We were stranded. Panic began to set in. Emily and Anne, the other two newcomers, clung to each other, their faces pale with fear. Seeing their distress, Jack suggested taking them back to the light and relative safety of the supermarket. Left to inspect the cars, Mark, Sarah, John, and I exchanged worried glances. "What now?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. We felt exposed, vulnerable in the open space of the parking lot. As we discussed our limited options, a sudden, blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It came from the direction of the supermarket. Without a word, we sprinted towards the building, fear lending speed to our steps. The supermarket loomed before us, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow. The bell above the door rang violently as we burst inside, our hearts pounding in our chests. Our breaths were ragged, hearts pounding as we reached the supermarket. The flickering neon sign cast a haunting glow, illuminating a scene of unimaginable horror. The bodies of Emily, Anne, and Jack lay before us, torn and twisted in unnatural positions, their lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. We stood frozen, the shock paralyzing us as we stared at the carnage. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, a stark reminder of our vulnerability in this nightmarish reality. The urge to flee was overwhelming, every instinct screaming to escape this place of death. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from within the supermarket, snapping us out of our trance. A shelf had collapsed, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence of the night. It was the trigger we needed. Mark, driven by primal fear, grabbed Sarah's hand and bolted, with John following close behind. I remained, my gaze fixed on the interior of the supermarket, trying to comprehend the chaos. That's when the alarm blared to life, its piercing siren slicing through the night. And in that moment, amidst the cacophony of sounds, I saw it, a silhouette in the shadows. It was an abomination, a grotesque fusion of wolf and man, but far more twisted and repulsive. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence, a predator sizing up its prey. My legs finally found their strength, and I ran, following the others into the moonlit night. The clouds gathered overhead, casting us into darkness as the lunar light waned. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, a frantic drumming that matched my steps. But I was slower, the terror and shock weighing me down. Soon I lagged behind the others. My breaths were short and labored, each inhale a struggle against the fear that threatened to consume me. Eventually, we had to stop, our bodies no longer able to sustain the frantic pace. We huddled together, panting and wide-eyed in the middle of the road. The night was oppressively silent, the sound of our heavy breathing the only sign of life. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came a howl. It was a long, mournful sound, filled with an ancient hunger and rage. It was the call of the beast, a sound that chilled us to our very souls. We exchanged terrified glances, realizing we were not the hunters in this game. We were the hunted, and the beast was closing in. The realization brought a new wave of panic, a desperate need to find shelter, to find safety. But where could we go? The supermarket was a death trap. The cars were useless, and the vast, open road offered no protection. We were exposed, vulnerable, and every shadow seemed to hide unspeakable horrors. "We need to keep moving," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's out there, waiting for us." We set off again, each step a battle against the fear that gripped our hearts. The howl of the beast echoed in our minds, a haunting reminder of the nightmare that had become our reality. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving. We were lost in a world of shadows and terror, with only the faint hope of dawn to guide us. Our feet pounded the pavement, the rhythmic thud a desperate mantra against the enveloping darkness. The road stretched endlessly before us, a vacant artery in the heart of a desolate landscape. Every so often I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the monstrous silhouette pursuing us. The hope of encountering another soul on this forsaken road was dwindling with each passing moment. Night had fully descended, its cloak of darkness punctuated only by the stark light of the full moon above. I pulled out my mobile phone, the screen a feeble light in the overwhelming darkness. No signal. We were still cut off from the world, alone in our plight. As we trudged forward, the distant howl pierced the night once more, sending a shiver down my spine. It was closer this time, a haunting reminder that our pursuer was still out there, biding its time. Panic surged through us and we broke into a run again. Our breaths came in short, sharp gasps, the cold air stinging our lungs. The relentless fear propelled us forward, the instinct to survive overriding all else. We had been running for what seemed like an eternity when a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. Headlights cut through the darkness, growing steadily closer. Our hearts leaped with renewed hope. Salvation at last, it seemed. We positioned ourselves in the middle of the road, arms waving frantically. The vehicle, a modest sedan, screeched to a halt mere inches from us. The driver, an elderly man with a face etched with lines of time, peered out, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. In a frenzy, we pleaded for his help, our words tumbling out in a torrent of desperation. After a moment of hesitation, he unlocked the doors and we clambered inside, a tangle of limbs and relief. John took the passenger seat, while Sarah, Mark, and I squeezed into the back. We urged the man to turn around, to drive away from the lurking horrors of the supermarket and whatever lay beyond. As the car turned and picked up speed, I saw the relief wash over my companions' faces, a brief respite in our night of terror. But when my gaze fell on John, my heart sank. His eyes darted nervously, his body tense, as if bracing for something. His unease was palpable, infecting the rest of us with a renewed sense of dread. What did he see? What did he know? Without warning, John lunged at the driver, his hands grappling for the steering wheel. The car swerved violently, the world outside spinning in a dizzying blur. Shouts and screams filled the air, a cacophony of terror and confusion. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the world went silent. The car had flipped, tumbling into a ditch by the side of the road. We hung suspended in our seats, the only sound our ragged breathing. As I struggled to comprehend what had just happened, the weight of John's actions bore down on me. What had driven him to such madness? Was it fear, or something more sinister? In the dim light of the car's interior, I saw the fear in my companion's eyes turn to confusion and then horror as they looked at John. His face was a mask of desperation, his eyes wild and unseeing. The aftermath of the car crash left us dazed and disoriented. Crawling out from the wreckage, we each bore the weight of our collective disbelief. Helping Sarah and Mark out, I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare. We all turned to John as he emerged, his body shaking uncontrollably, an unnerving sight that sent chills down my spine. Sarah's voice broke the tense silence, laden with despair. "John, why? Why did you do this?" But the man who faced us now was a distorted version of the friend we knew. His eyes were wild and his speech was erratic. "Where to carry this fool? I'll have to deal with you myself, sorry guys." His voice, barely recognizable, was a harbinger of the horror that was to unfold. The transformation was grotesque and seemed to defy the laws of nature. John's neck stretched unnaturally, his skin rippling as coarse hair sprouted across his body. His face contorted, elongating into a snout, while his teeth morphed into sharp, predatory fangs. The sight was so profoundly disturbing that it rooted me to the spot, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were witnessing. There, in the moonlight, stood a creature of legend, a werewolf, towering and ferocious. My legs trembled, every instinct screaming to flee, yet for a moment I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the scene before me. It was Mark who broke the paralysis, his survival instincts kicking in. He bolted, with Sarah following close behind him. The realization hit me like a cold wave. We had to scatter, to divide the beast's attention if any of us were to have a chance at survival. As the werewolf shook its massive head, seemingly disoriented by its own transformation, I seized the moment. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, my heart pounding in my chest, the beast's howls reverberating through the night air. I could hear its heavy footsteps behind me, the sound drawing closer with every passing second. I pushed myself harder than I ever thought possible, my lungs burning with each breath. The fear was a tangible force, driving me forward even as my muscles screamed in protest. I dodged through trees and leapt over bushes, the underbrush tearing at my clothes and skin. Somewhere in the distance I heard a scream, a sound so filled with terror that it spurred me to run even faster. The realization that the beast had chosen to pursue Mark and Sarah first was both a relief and a curse. Relief, because it gave me a chance to escape. A curse, because it meant my friends were in mortal danger. I continued to run, my mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. The night seemed endless, a labyrinth of darkness with no sign of safety or respite. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig underfoot, sent waves of panic through me. I was lost in a world of primal fear, where every shadow hid potential death. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into darkness, the world spinning around me until I crashed into the cold, hard earth. Pain shot through my body, and then everything went black. When consciousness returned, it was daylight. Sunlight streamed into the pit, blinding me momentarily. Pain racked my body as I tried to move, each muscle aching from the fall and the night's exertions. It took several agonizing attempts to pull myself out of the pit. Standing at the edge of the hole, I looked around. The daylight revealed a wild, unfamiliar terrain. The night's horrors seemed almost unreal in the harsh light of day. I stumbled towards the road, each step a testament to the previous night's terror. As I reached the road, a police car appeared. I waved my arms, relief flooding through me. The officers were cautious but listened as I recounted the harrowing events. Their skepticism was evident, and my heart sank with the realization that my story, as unbelievable as it was, might never be accepted as truth. They drove me back to the supermarket. The place was now a hive of activity with police and onlookers everywhere. I was interrogated by a senior officer, his expression one of polite disbelief. The futility of my situation weighed heavily on me as they placed me in the police car, destined for the station. As we drove, the memories of the previous night haunted me. The nightmare I had lived through seemed almost too surreal to believe. Sitting in the back of the car, I realized the harsh truth. In a world of rationality and logic, my story of horror and werewolves would always strain credulity. The car journey was a blur, my mind replaying the events over and over. The werewolf, the screams, the chase. It was a tale ripped straight from a horror film, yet it was my reality. And in that moment, the sinking feeling that no one would ever believe my story settled deep within me.